Yo, what's the deal with the US and China? A new Cold War is brewing, and we need to talk about it because it's going to change our world in ways we can't yet imagine. We've heard about it in the news lately. What we haven't heard is how this looks through the lens of game theory and how we can use this to invest and take advantage of this growing competition. I've been investigating this, and I need to share with you what I found. John von Neumann was a Hungarian immigrant to America who made all manner of contributions to science and technology. Among other things, von Neumann pioneered the field of game theory, especially in its application to defense planning. The field of game theory is divided into two parts: finite and infinite games. Finite games like sports have clear rules, fixed players, and agreed upon objectives. For example, having the most points before time expires. Infinite games, on the other hand, have both known and unknown players and no fixed rules. Instead of winning, the goal of the game is to simply stay alive and continue playing. There are no winners and losers. There's only players that keep playing and other players that leave the game due to the lack of will or of resources to continue. In a TED Talk given in 2015 by Simon Sinek, he explains how players in infinite games can often misunderstand the game they're playing. When two or more finite players play a game, like in a game of tennis, the situation is stable, and the same goes for when two infinite players play a game. An example of this is the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were playing for what they viewed as their survival and way of life. However, the US changed its perspective of the game when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The USA at that point declared victory, which, as we learned, is not possible in an infinite game. The game the US was playing did not end in 1989. Instead, the Soviet Union left the game and new players entered. These new players were radical Islam and China. The US has spent the last several decades in a handful of wars that turned into quagmires. From the perspective of game theory, this happened because it approached these wars as if they were finite games, with the goal being to win. They were actually infinite games that were not winnable. A few examples include being run out of Vietnam by the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were playing an infinite game and fighting for their survival. More recently, the war in Afghanistan gave a similar result, and the US left after realizing it was not a winnable war. The Taliban were playing the infinite game and willing to wait an eternity for the US to run out of the means or will to continue. As Mr. Sinek argued, the Cold War never ended, and instead the USSR left the game while new players entered. Since his talk in 2015, radical Islam has taken a less active role, and China has become the main player versus the US in the struggle for global supremacy. Since the Communist Party of China took over power in 1949, they've taken China from being dirt poor to being the second largest economy on earth. The US was cooperative with the rise of China. They passed favorable trade bills, encouraged businesses to move manufacturing there, and brought China into international groups. This, along with a population full of young, hardworking people, put China on the path to becoming the factory of the world. The leadership of America looked past their ideological differences with the CCP because they had the naive view that democracy would gain traction as the country became richer. Instead, the opposite happened, and in the 21st century we've seen China emerge into a totalitarian state that has a level of control over its population most Westerners cannot fathom. From Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, China has always been playing the infinite game on their road to national rejuvenation. However, their tactics have changed, with a new attitude of aggressiveness on the global stage. The US and China were cooperative on a strategic level in the period leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union. However, China began to view the US as an existential threat once it became the sole global superpower after the collapse of the USSR. The display of military dominance during Operation Desert Storm, along with the US response to the CCP's crackdown in Tiananmen Square, were additional factors leading to the shift in how the CCP viewed America. In the book The Long Game by Rush Doshi, Mr. Doshi argues that since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Chinese have transitioned through 3 tactics in their quest to undermine American supremacy: blunting, building, and currently, expansion. From 1989 to 2008, during the historic economic boom of China, the tactic of blunting was summed up in the words, "Hide your capabilities and bide your time." This phrase was made popular by Deng Xiaoping. The CCP largely put on a nice face when dealing with their Western counterparts and focused on being an economic powerhouse, which they achieved. After the financial crisis in 2008, China began to view the US as a power in decline. They moved from blunting to a tactic of building. The CCP saw an opportunity to start building their own international order, starting in their own region. China began the Belt and Road Initiative during this period. They sought to increase their influence in the Eurasian region and set the foundations for a new world order. We also saw Xi Jinping come to power and personify this new attitude. The third and latest tactic that the CCP is using is expansion. This means moving from building Chinese order in the region and expanding it to the global stage. The phrases "great changes unseen in a century" and "the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049" both sum up this new tactic. The Chinese government has become more aggressive on the global stage in the last several years. They've gained influence in international organizations like the UN, WTO, and WHO. The CCP has set ambitious goals to dominate any and all industries that the world will depend on this century. From AI, EVs, chips, space, lethal weapons, communications, biotech, and others, China understands that these are the industries that will matter more and more in the future. They have their sights set on dominating them. China has the means to do this with 4 times the engineers that America has and a massive manufacturing base. Their economy has yet to be tapped in terms of high innovation fields like planes, chips, and autos that they've typically purchased from the US and EU. China needs to create jobs for all of its educated people in the future. Thus, they have an incentive to cut Western tech out of the loop and foster their own homegrown companies as they move up the economic value chain. China is also making moves to undermine the demographic advantage that the US will have as this century progresses. Today alone, about 250 mostly young Americans will have died from an overdose of fentanyl. In the 12-month period ending in October of 2021, over 69,000 Americans died from fentanyl, which is double the amount of Americans from the same period 2 years earlier. It is also greater than the total number of Americans killed in the Vietnam War. Fentanyl originates in labs throughout China, where it is then shipped to Mexican cartels, added to all manner of existing street drugs, and brought across the border. Given that this problem has been getting worse for years, it is naive to think that it is not supported by the government of China. They are murdering young Americans on a massive scale. At the same time, China is pouring money into espionage and lobbying activities inside the United States. They've established a deep network to retrieve secrets and influence politicians and businesses to pursue outcomes more favorable to Beijing. TikTok, which has nearly 90 million users in the US, is a popular social media platform with young Americans. It is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance. TikTok requires all users to accept an intrusive privacy policy. It collects all manner of data from the user's device. This includes all internet data, biometric data, keystroke patterns, basically anything the user does on his or her phone inside or outside the app. It is essentially spyware packaged into a social media app. It's also naive to think the CCP is not directing ByteDance to collect this data. They are likely using this app to test AI algorithms and further sow political divisions in the US. The previous administration attempted to ban this app from operating in the US. However, after an expensive lobbying campaign from TikTok, This action was revoked by the Biden administration, and the app was allowed to operate freely again pending further review. China is also increasing its military spending at an accelerating rate. Although the US spends over 2 times as much as China on defense, China gets more bang for their buck as the US defense industry is swamped by contractors who charge much higher than market prices. Xi Jinping has stated that China will have a world-class military by 2049. You can't have a world-class military without real combat experience, so we can expect China to start wars in the next few decades to prove that their military has world-class capability. China has clearly been playing the long game for the last several decades. They've recently gained a level of assertiveness on the global stage with a set goal of achieving a Great Rejuvenation by 2049. Great Rejuvenation is synonymous with China becoming the central superpower of the world. It is a revival of the meaning of their name, the Middle Kingdom. One has to wonder if the CCP has become too cocky and is making a strategic blunder in this goal. Is it treating its power struggle with the US as a finite game that it must win by 2049? It's too soon to come to this conclusion, but it is something to consider. The question now is, what game is the US playing? There's one thing a deeply divided Washington seems to agree on, and it's China. The US approach to China shifted in a big way under the Trump administration, and this shift was telegraphed in Obama's pivot to Asia. The policies of Trump towards China have largely continued under the Biden administration. The genie is out of the bottle, so to speak. The USA seems to have acknowledged its wishful thinking of China turning into a democracy as their economy developed was flawed. From launching a trade war to clamping down on Chinese technology, the US now openly states that China is its greatest adversary. President Biden has framed this as a competition between autocracies and democracies that will shape the course of the 21st century. Although the US has been late to the game that China has been playing for decades, it still enjoys leads in many areas that China seeks to dominate. From having a global military footprint through a vast network of allies, to being home to the majority of the world's leading tech firms, the US is still in the lead on many fronts, but China is catching up. That said, China is weak in terms of food and energy security and also has a demographic problem that will get worse in time. The US has to walk a fine line by not pushing China too hard in that it derails it and in return destroys the global economy. China can't get hit hard for a long time or else it would bring about defaults and probably the worst worldwide recession ever seen. This outcome was not a possibility during the Cold War with the Soviets, as both economies were practically exclusive from one another. This is not the case with the US and China. However, the USA's problem is the CCP has the political ability to make quick moves and is likely willing to put their own people through more pain to achieve their goals than would ever be considered in the US. In order to keep the upper hand while not derailing China, Washington's only choice is to play the infinite game. Judging from recent rhetoric and actions, it appears Washington is starting to understand this. The only way to do this is to invest in America's own defense, communications, infrastructure, and emerging tech industries to try to stay ahead. Thus, the arms race and tech race with China is heating up big time. In the last several years, the US has begun making moves to cut dependence off of China in terms of rare earth metals and technology. By September of 2023, all companies that do business with or receive grants with the US federal government must comply with Section 889 of the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act. This is a beast of legislature that is mostly unknown to people. When enforced, Section 889 will require all companies in the US that have any relation to the federal government in any way to strip out any equipment from Huawei, ZTE, and several other Chinese tech companies. The US has also launched initiatives to secure rare earth metals which are crucial to military and technological development. To this point, rare earth metals has been a market that China has largely cornered. An executive order was signed by the Biden administration to bolster support for domestic rare earth producers like MP Materials. There has also been a bill introduced in the Senate called the Reshore Act, and it is currently in committee. If passed, this bill will further encourage rare earth extraction in the US and prohibit the use of Chinese rare earth metals from being used in any Department of Defense systems by 2026. Finally, the US has launched 2 initiatives to counter China's growing global ambitions. The first is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. This was agreed to by all G7 nations, and it will invest $600 billion in infrastructure projects around the globe in developing nations. It will act as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, it is an uphill battle. China has established itself as a leader in infrastructure, and they've already invested nearly $1 trillion in BRI projects. The second of these initiatives is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. This is an agreement between the US and a dozen countries in the Indo-Pacific region, like India, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, Vietnam, and others. This plan aims to increase economic and political cooperation between this group of nations. It will also offer incentives to companies wishing to relocate out of China. The execution of these plans by Washington and the continuation of the political will remains to be seen. We can assume with decent confidence that both the US and China are now playing an infinite game for global supremacy. We can look to the future with the assumption that this will continue until one or the other runs out of the will or resources to continue playing. Also, we can watch for new powerful players to emerge and change the dynamic of this game. The world has always been on fire. Wars, revolutions, terror attacks, pandemics. Powerful people enrich themselves off of these events. Why can't we? Instead of watching things happen, it's time to take action, and in this final section, we are going to become Cold War profiteers. With the growing competition between the US and China, there's endless ideas for investing. This power struggle covers all manner of fields in technology, defense, aerospace, chips, and more. I'm going to focus on what looks most attractive to me at this point in time. China's emerging semiconductor industry is an interesting area because so many of China's ambitions in areas like AI, quantum computing, space, and defense depend on having state-of-the-art chips. Recently, the US and its allies have made moves cutting China off from advanced chips. This has created an even greater incentive for China to pour money into their homegrown chip companies. However, these chip companies are only listed on Hong Kong, Shanghai, or Shenzhen exchanges. They are not easily available for foreign investors. There is one ETF, KraneShares China 5G and Semiconductor ETF, or KFVG, that has the most exposure to China's chip stocks and trades in the US. Keep in mind that this ETF is thinly traded and low in net assets. Other ETFs that give exposure to China's tech sector include KWEB, KSTR, and for a more general exposure to the Chinese market, FXI and Asher. On the US technology side, the ARK Innovation ETF offers exposure to new age tech companies that mostly operate in the US. This ETF has been destroyed over the last year and a half, experiencing a 70% drawdown from all-time highs. It is now sitting at levels that look attractive as an investment. For rare earth metals that are key inputs into technology and military, the opportunity is in the US as it seeks to cut dependence off of China for these inputs. 2 stocks worth looking at are MP Materials and Lithium Americas Corporation, both of which own and operate mines in the Western Hemisphere only. Although most American defense companies are sitting near all-time highs in stock price, there are 2 less obvious plays that have been beaten down in recent years and are starting to see better fortunes. These are Boeing and its part supplier Spirit AeroSystems. Boeing has experienced a string of bad news in its passenger jet business, but they are starting to put these problems behind them. It's easy to forget that 40% of Boeing's business is defense related. Boeing also offers exposure to the emerging space industry that will become a more and more important frontier in future conflicts. Spirit AeroSystems is an aerospace parts manufacturer that supplies parts to both Boeing and Airbus. It has also announced a plan to increase the defense portion of its business and sees an opportunity for growth in this area. In the future, more and more things will fly, and Spirit AeroSystems will be making parts for things that haven't been invented yet. It's an area that could explode in growth. This is Will. I make videos on global trends and how to profit from them. Don't consider any of this investment advice. Do your own research. Most importantly, if none of what I say happens or if my investments don't work out, just forget I ever said anything. I'll see you in the next episode.